What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Sports Religion YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be doing a full first round NFL mock draft for the 2025 season coming up. This is one of the more unpredictable drafts that I think we have seen in a long time. Considering what we came off last year, which was already an unpredictable draft, it's going to be even more so this year, I would imagine. So let's get right into it. The Tennessee Titans open up at number one here. I think that there's been a lot of buzz about the Titans drafting, a so-called generational player rather than a quarterback. However, this is coming straight from the Titans front office, and I'm going to be the first to call a smokescreen on this. I don't think that you can leave this fan base hanging for much longer, trying to look for any sort of hope in this, this horrible couple of seasons that they've managed to put together. You really got to take a quarterback that puts some excitement into this franchise and fan base. Nashville's a huge market. It's important to the league to have good football played there. So I think you really got to look at one of these quarterbacks. Now, I do not agree with taking a quarterback at one, but I think that's what the Titans are going to do. They got to get a guy in there who can be, the next step, because I think a fan base has suffered enough when you have Will Levis as your quarterback. He hasn't shown much. He's all physical tools, and they haven't really found a way to develop it. So for me, the guy that's received the most buzz recently has been Shedeur Sanders. I mean, you hear reports of Brian Daboll and the Giants going out to the Shrine Bowl, to evaluate him in person. So the Giants at 3 really like Shedeur, and I would imagine would be trying to trade up even to try to get him. But that's the problem with them being at 3. They chose to win the games that Drew Lock was starting in, and now that you don't end up with your pick at quarterback. So I think the Titans would go Shedeur Sanders here. It's got to be, some type of smokescreen to me to say we're going to take a generational player, Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. To me, those are the two guys that are generational in this draft. Instead of, finding your next answer at quarterback, you really got to just move on into the future here and, think about the star power that this brings to Nashville as well. Shedeur brings along, his dad, Deion, who's one of the most iconic football players of all time, one of the most iconic football coaches of the last few seasons. So you would get those personalities in Tennessee as, a package. And those guys the fans would come to that stadium and watch every single game because of that. So then you're left with the Browns at 2, and they're really in a similar situation. I think that this roster is closer to competing than people realize. They've got really good players up and down this team, and for whatever reason, they have just not put it together. They really failed Baker, in his years there. They didn't really put enough effort into putting him into situations where he could succeed, and, he had to play through a lot of injuries as well, and they kept trying to chuck him out there before he was ready. So I think they kind of failed their last shot at having a top quarterback in the draft. So, we all know what the Deshaun Watson situation is. I'm not even going to go into that. That has been covered too much over the last couple of years, quite frankly. So I think this is also a team that's got to look at quarterback and get some sort of excitement into the building. I mean, you hear players like Myles Garrett going into the media and basically blasting this front office and saying, he basically gave him an ultimatum. I'm out if you don't do winning moves now to make this team better. And, Myles Garrett's not someone you could just go out and replace. So you got to keep him happy. He's a vital part of this team. And having a quarterback that those guys are excited to go out there and play for every snap would go a long way. And the only guy you can look at here is Cam Ward. I mean, none of the other quarterbacks, to me at least, are really worth taking here. Dylan Gabriel had a really good season with the Ducks, but he's really small. He's a lefty. Lefty quarterbacks are kind of a different story in the NFL. So I would personally go with Cam Ward, just with that playmaking ability that he has. He's got an NFL talented arm here, and we've seen him come from a really small school in Incarnate Word, and then he jumped up to Washington State, and he made that gap look like nothing, and that's really impressive stuff that shouldn't go unnoticed. It takes a special kind of player to be able to jump from that low level of competition to the Pac-12 and put up numbers immediately, and not just any numbers, like pretty much leading the nation in a lot of statistical categories, for that offense. And he really did that for 2 years at Washington State and probably could have gone to the draft last year, but this is just the world we live in where players come back for their 6th year now, and Miami, made a good choice in bringing him in, and he had another monster year. He pretty much was carrying that team all season, and he'd go into Cleveland in a situation where they have a good offensive line, they have a really good defense, they have some nice skill pieces in David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy, on the outside as well. So I think Cam Ward, just even if Shedeur Sanders falls to them at 2 and the Titans take Cam Ward instead, I mean, you're still resetting your quarterback window, and it's now or never for the Browns, because eventually you're going to start losing a lot of these key veteran pieces that have been mainstays on your team over the last couple of seasons and have contributed a lot to this team. They train all off season to try to get another couple of wins for this franchise, and they never do it. And it's tough for a team like this and a fan base like this that's so passionate about football just to keep losing year in and year out. So I think Cam Ward accomplishes what you need to accomplish there at 2, and you have a really exciting and electrifying quarterback to go into the future with. So the Giants at 3 kind of get screwed out of the top 2 quarterbacks. I know that, like I said earlier, Dable's doing a lot of in-person scouting with Shedeur, so if he somehow does get to 3 or they trade up, I would have no doubt in my mind that they take Shedeur Sanders. But clearly he's not available here, and this is where you kind of have the debate. Do you want generational player in Travis Hunter who can play both sides of the ball for you? I absolutely think they need another corner across from Deonte Banks to make that defense kind of come to life a little bit more. And you could take Abdul Carter, but then you'd have an absolutely insane pass rush. They already have Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau, Dexter Lawrence up front. You add Abdul Carter into that, I mean, there's no blocking that. They would have a instant pass rush every play. But you cut Daniel Jones last year, and they never seem to get this position right, and so you got to look quarterback here. We've seen the clips of Joe Shane, their GM, kind of. It almost sounds like he's getting a little crazy with how much he's saying he wants to win now. And I don't know how else you would accomplish that by without taking a quarterback, or at least trying your shot at one. So the guy I'm actually going to take here for them is Jackson Dart. And now that may make a lot of people kind of wonder why would you ever do this at number 3. But I'll tell you guys, Jackson Dart is legit. He's got good size. He runs the ball quite a bit too. It takes a lot of punishment in the SEC, and he gets up every time. He's ready to go for the next snap. So his toughness is a very big part of his game, and you kind of need that if you're in New York, because their line is not the best right now. And you'd want a quarterback who's used to taking a bit of a beating and is ready to go each and every snap. He's also got a very big arm. Like, people don't give him enough credit for this, but he's got a monster arm. And I think that a lot of people, when they see Ole Miss quarterbacks, they kind of think of Matt Corral in the past, who put up huge numbers with them. It is a very quarterback-friendly system, but Jackson Dart is legit. I mean, I think I first heard of him when he was at USC, and they were playing against Washington State. I believe it was right at the beginning of the season. Their starter, who was Keaton Slovis at the time, he went down with an injury, and Jackson Dart came in, and it was like there was no change. He came right in without ever having started a game before, and I think he put up almost 400 yards of offense, threw 4 touchdowns, and they pounded Washington State in that game with Jackson Dart as their quarterback. And so I really thought he had a bright future at USC, but then he ends up transferring to Ole Miss and has 3 phenomenal years under Lane Kiffin in that system. So I think this is a guy who's played a lot of football, a lot of really high-quality football, and is a great thrower of the football. And, I mean, you got to have something here if you're the Giants to look forward to next season. So I would absolutely take Jackson Dart over any of the other QBs that are, in front of him on this PFF big board. So with that, the Giants get their quarterback at 3, and we'll go on to 4. The Patriots are in a spot where they have to start building around Drake May. We saw what he put on tape last year. It looked really good. And, that's a really nice feeling when you're picking in the top 5 and you don't have to worry about quarterback. Most of these teams are sweating bullets knowing that they might not get the quarterback they've done a lot of research on. And, they had that set up already. So this is where you really have, in my opinion, the best 4 players are in front of you here, and you're picking at number 4. So the Patriots have all the power in the world in this draft, if you ask me. They could even sell this pick and trade out of it and get a ton of capital. But for the sake of this exercise, we're not going to do any trades. So to me, you take Travis Hunter here. Obviously, I mean, the guy won the Heisman this year, plays both sides of the ball. He would be an amazing corner across from Christian Gonzalez in that secondary, or be a weapon on offense. And the main negative with Travis Hunter is that he's just still a little bit small. He's a young player. He hasn't fully, developed a lot of strength yet, really, and that'll change in an NFL weight room. I'm telling you, he'll get some more mass on him, and he'll be even more of a ferocious player than he already is. But when you look at him from a receiver perspective, he almost reminds me of Justin Jefferson, just the way he glides through his routes, in and out of his breaks, and he's a contested catch maniac. Like, it doesn't look like it from his physique, but he gets up there and he takes whatever football is thrown his way. So to me, that's just another franchise cornerstone for this Patriots team that they really haven't had in a long time. A guy with that type of athleticism, because Bill Belichick would have never drafted a guy like Travis Hunter. Let's just be honest with that. He would have gone for probably a lineman or a pass rusher. I mean, Bill was very old-fashioned, but times are different now. You have Mike Vrabel as your coach. That's a really exciting thing for New England fans, and I think Travis Hunter would sell a ton of jerseys there. He'd be a phenomenal piece on that offense. So now we have the Jags at 5. They just fired Trent Baalke as their general manager, which makes this a bit more difficult, because I feel like when Trent Baalke was in charge of their picks, we knew exactly what type of players Trent Baalke would like to, have in that front and have in that team. And he was really all about the profile and the athletic traits of a guy. So, a guy like Abdul Carter, he'd be a Jaguar if Trent Baalke was making this pick. It doesn't even matter that they already have Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines-Allen there. He would choose him anyway. And so now that he's gone, we don't really know what they're going to do. And I think it's a team that has a lot of talent on offense, a lot of really nice weapons. It's just they don't really have, a lot of good pieces on defense that can get the ball back in Trevor Lawrence's hands. And so for me, the guy that would fill a very big need would be Mason Graham. I know that Abdul Carter's sitting here, and to me, Abdul Carter's the best player in the entire draft. So you can do with that what you want. I mean, the Jags could very well take Abdul Carter and just have an insane trio of edge rushers. But, you already have Trayvon Walker and Josh Allen, both really high-quality guys who are going to continue to play at that level for a long time. So for me, I would go with Mason Graham here, and just like even last year, you could tell this guy was going to be an NFL player right away, and he followed up with another massive year. Pretty much the heart and soul of this team, considering Michigan had zero offense, zero passing game. This was a defensive-led team, and it was led by those two guys right in the middle of their defense. Him and Kenneth Grant were the reason that this team even got to 7 and 8 wins this year. I mean, he is a phenomenal defensive lineman. This is the type of guy who's going to be an instant impact player in the NFL and going to be a nightmare for guards, to try to play one-on-one. So the biggest thing with him is everybody says he looks like he's going to have short arm length when he measures in at the draft or at the combine, but we just saw Braden Fisk go to the Rams and have a monster year, and he was a guy who had really short arms at the combine too. So I think you just take the best player here you can on the defensive line and go with Mason Graham. And then, you pair him up with Eric Armstead. You drafted Mason Smith last year, who's another freak athlete on the defensive line. That's easily going to be one of the most athletic and ferocious defensive lines in the league. But we'll see if the Jaguars really can kind of harness those guys and put it all together, because they just really haven't been able to have a ferocious defense that can get that ball back to the offense and allow Trevor Lawrence to really feel comfortable in a game. So the Raiders at 6, unfortunately, they're going to miss out on a quarterback unless, you want to take Jalen Milroe here. I mean, he's the only guy left who really has what I would consider even first-round traits, but still, I don't think Jalen Milroe is a first-round player. He really had a rough end of the season. It just didn't look like the same player that we had seen, in previous games. And, I think that really hurts his draft stock here, because if he had a season like he had 2 years ago, he would be right up here, and I guarantee you the Raiders would be looking at him. But I just don't see it with him right now. I think he's got a long way to go. He needs to sit behind somebody and develop, and the Raiders just do not have that infrastructure to create a spot for a guy like this to kind of learn and sit behind someone. So the guy that I'm going to go with here is Abdul Carter, who's the best player on the board easily. I mean, this guy is just he's another alien in a long line of aliens from Penn State on the defensive line. I mean, you look in their past, they've got Micah Parsons, Odafe Owe, Adisa Isaac last year. Those guys are they're just monsters. Yetur Gross Matos is another one I think of. And whatever it is at that Penn State program, they've got the conditioning and the weightlifting program down to a science, because they make these guys in a lab essentially every year. And I think that you just don't get many players like Abdul Carter. He's got a really interesting career path trajectory too. He started out as a true middle linebacker and was very impactful right away. And what I remember about his freshman year is he got ejected for targeting against Purdue, and I think that really, that was within his first couple of games. It really changed him as a player, where he's like, okay, I'm not going to make that mistake again. And, we never saw him get ejected for something like that again. And I think that shows a lot of accountability, that he's able to improve upon his game and become a highly disciplined player. And so this past season, Tom Allen comes in as the defensive coordinator for Penn State. They move him to defensive end, which I thought was an interesting choice, considering he's technically a bit undersized for being a true edge, but he put all those doubts to rest right away. I mean, this is a monstrous pass rusher. He's got unreal twitch, unreal ability to bend the edge, and he's going to be a monster in the NFL right away. Very similar to Micah Parsons, and I hate that comparison just because it seems like we're saying that because he wore number 11 at Penn State, but I mean, this guy truly is what Micah Parsons is, and the Raiders are going to get him next to Max Crosby, who's already a versatile chess piece on that defensive line, and they have Christian Wilkins inside. Tyree Wilson's developing nicely. I think that you just have really, the foundation of an elite defense right there. So with that, I'd be very happy if I was the Raiders front office getting, probably the best player in the entire draft, 1A, 1B with Travis Hunter. So the Jets here at 7, this is a bit of a difficult pick. I think that Aaron Rodgers is going to end up coming back next year. So to me, that means you really got to fix this offensive line, because he's going to be 42 during the season next year, and he's going to have a lot of trouble evading the pass rush like he has in the past. I mean, we already saw him miss the entire year because they couldn't block it up front. So the guy you got to look at here to me is Will Campbell. I mean, this guy's a monster. He has improved every year at LSU. And I really think that he projects as a guard, so you could push him inside next to Olu Fashanu, who they drafted next year, and then your offensive line, you have Olu Fashanu, Will Campbell, and Joe Tippmann at center. Like, those are 3 really good young offensive linemen who are only going to get better. And I mean, you listen to the way Will Campbell talks about things. Like, this guy's a true football player. You can tell that he is going to be, just from a personality standpoint, a huge benefit to a team that I think sometimes lacks really, loud, solid, stable voices in their organization. So for me, I would take Will Campbell all day. You're getting the best lineman in this draft by far. And, that just ensures that you're going to protect Aaron Rodgers next year, or whoever. I mean, maybe they do end up making a change at quarterback, but either way you look at it, that offensive line is not good enough. It's not good enough to win a championship right now. And adding Will Campbell instantly makes that a 10 times better unit. So I can't say it enough how much better that's going to make the Jets' offensive line. Now you have the Panthers at 8. Very intriguing signs for them that Bryce Young kind of picked it up at the end of the year. So that means that they're kind of out of the quarterback sweepstakes for this draft, and makes them feel a little bit better about that investment. But you look at this defense, there's nobody on that defense besides J.C. Horn and Derek Brown. And Derek Brown missed all of last season, so you didn't even have him to lean on. And J.C. Horn's been in and out of the lineup a lot, but when he's in there, he looks like an elite corner. So I think that you just look at the lack of playmakers in their front 7, and you got to look at James Pierce Jr. from Tennessee. This guy had a monster year 2 seasons ago. I think he had 13.5 sacks. Didn't quite have that production this year, only about 8.5. But I truly think he was playing through an injury this year. He just looked a little bit slower to me, and he was in and out of a few different games. The wild thing about him is I think he's only played about 900 snaps in his entire career at Tennessee, and that's because they have this really weird hockey style rotation where they flip guys in and out of that defensive line all the time. And so these guys really don't get a lot of run, up front. They rotate them out and keep them fresh, but that's more of a testament to the system that Tennessee has and the depth that they're able to recruit along their defensive line, than necessarily a negative about James Pierce. He's just a fresher player. He's going to be young. He's not going to have a lot of experience compared to some of the other guys. But the other key part of this is James Pierce actually played his high school ball in Charlotte. He's from Charlotte, North Carolina. So you're getting a hometown guy who's potentially going to be an impact player from day one, really close to home. And you can tell the Panthers value that because, you look last year where they traded back into the first round to get Xavier Legette, who's from that area as well. So you could tell they really value getting those guys who can be, personalities and understand what it's like to play in that local community. And, I think players from that area really value going and returning home. I mean, you look at Jair Alexander on the Packers when they returned home to Carolina. He crashed the coin toss because he wanted to be an honorary captain just because they were playing in his hometown of Charlotte. So, I mean, you can tell that football players tend to want to go back to Charlotte when they're from there. And I think James Pierce, it's just a match made in heaven. You really don't have you don't even have an edge rusher right now who's that impactful. So he would start day one and he would give you really high upside. And I think he's the type of player that Brian Burns was for them even, and so that just adds another playmaker to that defense that really lacks a lot of high quality guys. So at 9, the Saints are up, and this is kind of an interesting one. I think they could certainly use some offensive line help. Another receiver next to Chris Olave would be really nice. But to me, I think I'm going to go with, you look at that defensive line. They signed Chase Young this year. He's going to be a free agent. They have Cameron Jordan. He's, I don't know what the status really is with him. Is he going to come back another year? You really can't count on him to come back for another season. So you got to draft another guy into that edge room. And the Saints really like bigger edge rushers. That's what they've gone with pretty much the entirety of the last 10 years. That's what they draft. And, for me, the guy that kind of fits that bill is Mykel Williams out of Georgia. This was a guy who was projected to have a monster season this year, and he really didn't. He had an ankle injury, missed a lot of games, but still had 5 sacks, which is decent considering the time he missed, and he was probably playing hurt through much of that. But, this is a guy who's really raw. He's pretty much just a ball of clay. He doesn't have a lot of pass rush moves yet, but he's really stout against the run, and I think that goes a long way. And this was a guy who, before the season, was receiving, number 1 overall pick type of buzz. That's what kind of talent he is. So the Saints could easily go with Mykel Williams here and, turn him into something special. He could even sit behind Cam Jordan. And, I think they've got a few other guys there. Carl Granderson, Nathan Shepard. They've got some really solid defensive ends there right now. And, he would fit that Saints mold that they've gone with time and time again. And I'm telling you, this guy absolutely has the traits to be a top 10 pick this year. And I think it's more likely than not it's going to happen. And the Saints would absolutely take a guy like that, too, to kind of reset their edge rush room and get a new, fresh face in there. So here at 10, we have the Bears, and they need a whole ton of offensive line help. But I also think that this front office kind of behaves like, they're a little bit more about drafting playmakers rather than long-term stability on the offensive line. So the guy I look at here is Ashton Jeanty, and taking a running back this high has been frowned upon in recent years, but you look at the season that running backs just had across the NFL, like this was the era of the running back. The resurgence is here, and if you don't have an elite running back, pretty soon you're going to be selected out of the league, and your offense is not going to look as efficient as the rest of the league is. So for me, they should take Ashton Jeanty here, develop a stable run game alongside Caleb Williams, because that makes his life so much easier, and it takes a lot of the pressure off of him to constantly make plays. And you look at that firepower they have on offense. Then they have Rome Odunze, DJ Moore. Now you add Ashton Jeanty into this. Cole Kmet's a nice piece. I think that's just something that would be an electrifying piece to this offense, especially with Ben Johnson coming in. You could use him in a lot of different and creative ways that you can't really use DeAndre Swift or Roschon Johnson, who they have there now. But I think that's a great pick for the Bears, and I just don't know how you can look at Ashton Jeanty and let him get by you there, especially with just what he's put on tape this year. So the Niners are here at 11, and it seems like every year we bang the drum that they need offensive line help because Trent Williams is aging, and a few of their interior guys just aren't really that good. But you kind of look yourself in the mirror and go, when has that mattered? That has never stopped this offense. This is always a top 10 offense. Most of the times it's top 5. With a healthy CMC, they just kind of do whatever they want. And when they have all their pieces going and Kyle Shanahan's really on his game, the offensive line has never been a big issue. It's never been a reason why they lose games. It just doesn't matter for them as much. And so you look at what they've kind of been missing the last few years that they had on a few of their dominant playoff runs, and that's just the defensive line has not been good. Like, really losing Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner has made it tough on this team, I think, because those guys were so critical to how effective this defense was at getting after the quarterback and stopping the run. Like, that was their trademark for the last 4 or 5 seasons, and they just don't have that this last year. I mean, they signed Javon Hargrave, and he goes down within the first couple of weeks, so there's really no return on investment there, and you don't really have a lot of young guys behind that coming up. I mean, you've got Malik Collins coming back, but he's a really nice player, but he's not exactly a dominant one. So the guy that I would look at here is Kenneth Grant, and I'm drafting him a lot higher than what PFF thinks he's worth in this draft, but I'm telling you, these interior defensive linemen go a lot higher usually than you might think. And Kenneth Grant, He teamed up with Mason Graham this last year at Michigan to provide, I think the most dominant interior duo in college football last year. And, he's a mammoth guy. He's 6'3", 339 pounds. You're not going to move that in the run game either. So I think that this 49ers defensive front could be really dominant next year if they draft a player like Kenneth Grant. You obviously have Nick Bosa on the outside. We all know what he does. So I think that the 49ers go back to their bread and butter and draft a really dominant defensive lineman. So next up, the Cowboys at 12. This would have been the perfect spot for Ashton Jeanty if he was still here, but he's not. So I think, you really got to look at a few other needs here, and they really just don't have an alpha receiver outside of CeeDee Lamb. So for me, it's easily Tetairoa McMillan in this spot. This guy gets compared to Mike Evans all the time just because of his height and, the speed profile that he's got. He's a mismatch nightmare for smaller corners, and I think you add him across from CeeDee Lamb, that takes a ton of pressure off of CeeDee Lamb, a ton of attention away from him, and, that's just for the best because they'll get Dak Prescott back. They've got some nice pieces on the offensive line that are coming along, and you just need some sort of firepower on that offense because otherwise you're going to be, they'll just key in on CD and they'll shut him down, with triple teams or whatever. They always bracket those number 1 receivers. So I think T-Mac next to CeeDee Lamb would be a phenomenal wide receiver duo, and it's kind of, this is kind of what teams want. They want one dominant jump ball receiver like this and one speed guy, and that's what they would have next year. So the Dolphins at 13, you could go a few different ways with this one as well. I think that they really need some help in the secondary. Like, we know Jalen Ramsey's a playmaker. He's one of the elite corners in the game. But corner is a weak link system. It's not about your best guy. It's about your worst guy. And this year they really got exposed in the secondary. I mean, they really didn't have much depth once their starting guys went down. So for me, it's Will Johnson here. This guy's been a number 1 corner since his freshman year. It's that simple. One of the most dominant players in college football over the last couple of seasons. He had a really rough go of it this year with, I think an ankle injury. So he missed a lot of time. But Will Johnson's going to be fine. He'll test good at the combine, and he'll be a great player. Like, this is a guy who should probably be going top 5, but just because of the way this draft works out, he's not. And so the Dolphins, you have Will Johnson and Jalen Ramsey in your secondary. That's a phenomenal duo, and it would really help the back end of their defense there because they've invested a lot in the front already. They've got players up front. It's just a matter of those guys staying healthy and kind of putting it all together. So the Colts at 14, they're kind of in an interesting spot with, Anthony Richardson and his development, but I would keep throwing things at this defense, and I think they really need a difference-making safety on the back end. This secondary is pretty atrocious when you look at it on paper. Like, I think their best player is Kenny Moore in the slot, and it's just like outside of that, it doesn't really get any better. So I know a lot of people will take Malachi Starks here because he's pretty much been an NFL guy since his freshman year as well. Like, I mean, we saw in that his first year against Oregon, he made a phenomenal interception against Bo Nix in that Week 1 matchup. made highlight reels all over the place. But I'm actually going to go with a different safety here, and that would be Nick Emanwari from South Carolina. Like, this guy was an absolute monster this year. I mean, if you look at his size, too, 6'3", 227. That's like a freight train coming downhill to hit you every play. And you look at his coverage grade too. Like, he can cover well for that size. And I think he's just one of those tweener players who could play either linebacker or safety in your defense and be, he's hyper athletic too. Like, this whole South Carolina team they recruit elite athletes. That's just what they do down there. And Emanwari, I'm telling you, like, there's not a lot of buzz around him, but he could easily go this high in the draft. I wouldn't be shocked at all if this happens. And, he played 400 coverage snaps, too. That's the other thing. So he played a ton in coverage, a ton in run. And, he's really just... I think he had 2 pick sixes this year, if I'm not mistaken. But this is a guy he's always around the ball. He would easily be a difference-making safety. And, the Colts kind of like guys like this with this mold, this hyper-athletic type of traitsy sort of player. And I think that he has just as much of a chance to be safety one in this draft as Malachi Starks does. I mean, a lot of people might disagree with that, but it's just the way it's going to work out. And I'm telling you, this is a real player here. This is a really good player. He's going to go higher than people think, and he would be an instant impact for that Colts secondary that so desperately needs players. Like, they just really don't have many people there. And I think Nick Emanwari is going to be a Pro Bowl caliber player in the NFL. I really do. So with that, we go on to the Falcons at 15. They really just they don't have a pass rush at all. So I'm not even going to look at any other position except edge rusher here. The guy that comes up to me first is Mike Green. He led the nation in sacks this year with 17 sacks. I mean, there's no denying that's just those numbers are incredible. The only problem is he played for the Thundering Herd at Marshall, and a lot of people might question that level of competition, but I'm telling you, he's really a guy who excelled at rushing the passer, and there's just not a whole lot of guys like that. And this edge rush class, it was a bit disappointing this year because there were a lot of guys with really high expectations, and they just didn't put up numbers the way we kind of thought they would. So I think Mike Green would be an instant impact player on this Falcons front. They traded for Matthew Judon, and it was kind of a disappointment. I'm not going to lie. I just don't think Matthew Judon is the high-quality pass rusher he once was in New England and Baltimore. So I think you have to move on here and, take Mike Green. He actually started his career at Virginia, I believe, and, he transferred for whatever reason. But absolutely dominated that level of competition that the Thundering Herd go up against, So I think Mike Green, perfect fit for the Falcons, would give them an elite playmaker on that front seven, and, they should be really happy with that type of player. So next up, we have the Cardinals, and I'm going to look on the offensive line here. Paris Johnson really came on this year and looked like a dominant tackle that he was drafted to be. So I think you also got to draft another player of that caliber next to him. And for me, that's Kelvin Banks. He's been the second best lineman in the country all year, in my opinion, just behind Will Campbell. And it's really not been by much. I mean, those are both phenomenal tackles. They're going to be great in the NFL. But I just think that, this is how the draft kind of shakes out, and he falls a little bit more to the Cardinals here. That just ensures that you have an extra layer of protection for Kyler Murray because, you don't want him taking as many hits as he's certainly taken in his career. So Kelvin Banks to the Cardinals, I think, is a great fit for them. And then you have the Bengals here at 17. I mean, they always need offensive line help. They never seem to be able to protect Joe Burrow, and I think it's a big part of the reason why they haven't gone farther into the playoffs or even, completed the Super Bowl run yet. But for me, you're likely going to lose T. Higgins in free agency. I think T. Higgins is going to get upwards of $30 million thrown at him. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's kind of what teams are willing to pay for an alpha receiver these days. So for me, you could easily replace him with Luther Burden III. And this was a guy who had huge recruiting buzz out of high school, like highlight reel catches every game he was in high school. Out of East St. Louis, Illinois, so just across the border from St. Louis. There's a really high level of competition actually in that area. A lot of good high school teams, but he's a phenomenal player. He had a monster year 2 years ago. Didn't really put up those numbers this year, but I still think there's something there. He reminds me actually a lot of Jamar Chase, who they already have on the roster. They're very similar build, slick route runners. They just seem to come down with every ball thrown their way. So I think you get an easy replacement for T. Higgins there with Luther Burden, and you have two just absolute monsters in your receiving core, and him and Jamar Chase. So the Seahawks at 18, this is just a pick. I wish the Seahawks had a higher pick than this because they could really use, I think a blue chip player to kind of impact their roster. But the guy I'm going to go with here is Josh Conerly from Oregon. This offensive line, it's one of the 2 or 3 worst offensive lines in the entire league, and it really showed this year. Especially when Geno Smith's your quarterback, that's the type of guy you have to have time for because he really just can't do much under pressure. And I think, he's the perfect statue in an offense where he's a game manager type. So for me, Josh Conerly fits the bill. He was the only player in that Ohio State game that Oregon lost in the playoffs who actually, I thought, held his own in the trenches. So for me, he stays in the Pacific Northwest as well. Not a very far journey from Eugene, Oregon, down to Seattle, and I think he's got all the ability of a franchise tackle there for them. So that would help protect Geno Smith next year because I don't see them making quarterback change right away. So we have the Buccaneers here at 19, and I think this team hasn't gotten what they thought they were getting with Joe Tryon-Schrank on the edge. So you really got to look for an edge rusher here if you're the Buccaneers. And they're kind of in a spot where they're going to probably lose Levante David as well. So, I think you could look at a few different guys here. I really think that you could, you could look at, I know that Shamar Stewart's right here, but I just don't think he's really their type. They kind of like speedier guys. I absolutely think Donovan Ezrako's, a Todd Bowles type, if you will. He would fit into that system really well. He would provide you with day one pass rush upside, and he really turned it on down the stretch as well with his run defense because he's a smaller guy, so a lot of people kind of just assume he's not going to hold his own in the run, but he really did a good job of setting a hard edge down the stretch, and it was easily, I think Boston College's best player. But, Walter Nolan's here. There's a few other impact guys. But the guy I'm going to look at here is Jalen Walker, especially with Levante David likely moving on, or at least he's not sure about his future. You play Jalen Walker, who had 6.5 sacks last year in that Todd Bowles scheme. I think he could potentially be a monster as well. He's coming into this whole process as a middle linebacker, but when he was on the edge, he really looked special to me and just flashed a lot of ability. So for me, the Buccaneers get a high upside pass rusher right there, and he's going to contribute day one to that defense. And Todd Bowles will definitely get the most out of him. He always gets the most out of defensive guys. It's a franchise that's really good at supporting young players and getting the most out of them. We look at Tyke Smith this last year, who's been a monster for them as well. So I think Jalen Walker's a great fit for the Buccaneers and would look really good in those colors as well. So the Broncos here at 20, for me, They take Tyler Warren. Like, this is a Sean Payton guy all the way. This is one of the most dominant tight ends you'll see, in a long time. And we say that every year about whatever tight ends at the top, with Brock Bowers last year, and then it was Kyle Pitts the year before. So we're saying it again with Tyler Warren, and I think that, this guy, he runs, he passes, he catches, he does everything for them. He blocks, and Sean Payton loves those fundamental type of football players, and you could really get a dominant target for Bo Nix as well. I think they just need one more pass catcher in that offense besides Cortland Sutton that could really, take the top off the defense. So for me, Tyler Warren's a great fit for the Broncos, great inline blocker for their run game as well. So the Steelers at 21, I think they need, a little bit more playmaking ability. Their offense just doesn't really scare me that much. There's not a guy who keeps you up at night if you're game planning against him. So for me, I'd absolutely be taking Emeka Egbuka here, the best receiver left on the board, in my opinion. And, he's been at Ohio State a long time. I think he actually set the record for the most receptions at Ohio State, which is pretty phenomenal considering the receivers they put into the league the last couple of seasons. So for me, Emeka Egbuka is a great target here for, I'm assuming Justin Fields is going to be their quarterback, but, he settles into the zones really nicely. He's a very smooth operator in that regard, and I think him and George Pickens would make a really nice duo at receiving core. But to me, you got to get another receiver and just get some more playmaking ability there. Now the Chargers at 22. This is an interesting spot where Colston Loveland's still on the board. Jim Harbaugh's guy he coached in college, so you could easily take him there. You could take Tyleik Williams too. They always need defensive line help in the middle, it seems. But I'm actually going to go for a bit of a different path here, and I'm going to take Cam Scatabo. And you may be thinking like, why would you take Cam Scatabo? He's not a first round player. But I really disagree with that. I think you look at the way that this guy just willed his team to pushing Texas to their limit, in the college football playoff. He gave that team all they could have. I mean, he led them in receiving yards, in passing yards and rushing yards. Like, this guy's a monster. And the best part about his game is his physicality, in my opinion. Like, this guy will not lose, a one-on-one physical matchup. Like, he will run you over every time. And I think, there was an article out about him, how when he was younger, he would take his brother's football pads and run into utility poles just for the fun of it. Like, that's a maniac right there, and that's someone that would do a lot in Jim Harbaugh's offense, especially because they don't really have a running back that I think really scares anybody either. And Jim Harbaugh has 2 fullbacks on the roster, so he's all about that smash mouth type of football, and that's exactly who Cam Scatabo is. He's never going to shy away from any contact. Like, this guy will run you over. He'll get out in the flat, too, and he actually shows a lot of speed to me. So I think this is a guy who will go a lot higher than people might actually realize, and to me, he fits exactly the culture that Jim Harbaugh wants. He fits the type of player Jim Harbaugh looks for, and he fits that offense very well because they're going to become a power run team in the future here. Just with the signs that we've seen already from what Jim Harbaugh wants to go with. So the Packers here at 23, this is an easy one for me. I think they take Shamar Stewart. This guy is totally a Brian Gutekunst type right here. He's 6'6", 290. So that's phenomenal size. You just don't see guys that tall, at edge rusher very often. And especially with the weight he carries too, he doesn't really look like he's that heavy. I mean, he looks like he's able to just bend the edge as well as anybody. I mean, the only problem with him is he just doesn't have any pass rush moves. He's just a huge dude in the middle of that defense who kind of wins with athleticism and strength. He just kind of runs you over or bull rushes through you. And I think that's exactly what the Packers have taken every other year in the past. They'll take an edge rusher like this who's a freak athlete. I mean, I already know Shamar Stewart's going to test out of this world at the Combine. That's just a given with just what he puts on tape. And, I think the Packers, they need some pass rush help. They just never take a guy who's going to be an impact day one guy. They'd rather take a developmental guy who could become a freak in the future. And we're seeing that already with Lucas Van Ness. They took him at 13 a few years ago. He really hasn't developed into what they wanted him to. So I think you could start that process over here with Shamar Stewart, get a massive guy on the edge there, and potentially develop into something really special if you give him the right tools to succeed. Now the Vikings at 24, I think they need a lot of corner help, but the issue to me with Benjamin Morrison, the best corner left, he had a hip injury early on in the season, and that's the last part of the body I want a corner to be dealing with. I mean, a hip injury, you need your hips to be fluid as a corner to be able to change direction and keep up with these elite receivers. And if you can't do that because of an injury, then, I mean, what purpose does the first-round pick here serve? So for me, they should go Omarion Hampton here. This guy's unbelievable physical tools. Like, this is a Saquon Barkley type of running back here. Huge lower body, massive strength. I mean, he'll run through you. He's a phenomenal receiver, too, and people don't give him credit for that. They just think of the power run game with North Carolina, but he really is a good receiver. And, you saw last year with Drake May, he was really effective. So the big question was, how would this year affect, Omarion Hampton's production without, Drake May to kind of take a lot of the stress off of him? And he responded with essentially the same season as he had the year before. I mean, you look at these stats he put up, 1,600 yards. He had more yards this year. So this production speaks for itself as well. Like, this is phenomenal production. Touch the ball a lot, high volume guy, and I think in Kevin O'Connell's offense, that's what they're missing in my opinion to kind of push them over to the next level. And they have Aaron Jones, who had a great season, but he's a bit older and he was only on a 1-year deal. So why not draft Omarion Hampton here? To me, that's as good as it gets for the Vikings. Then they have just unreal firepower on their offense going forwards. So the Texans at 25, I think they're missing some guys up front. Like, D'Amico Ryans is always going to get the most out of this defense, no matter the personnel they have, but they just don't really have a big run stuffer in the middle. And when I think run stuffing in this draft, I think Tyleik Williams, because that's all he did at Ohio State. Like, he really had no pass rush production, and that's not what you're going to get when you draft him. But this guy is huge. He's hard to move, and he really had a nice stretch of games throughout the college football playoff. He helped his draft stock a lot. So to me, the Texans should take him and get a very young body in the middle of that defensive line who could stop the run, especially with the running backs and how important running the running game is becoming in the NFL again. So a guy like that, I think, just pushes that Texans defense over the edge, and D'Amico Ryans is going to get the most out of him and develop him into a really nice player. So here at the Rams, I'm going to give the Rams Malachi Starks, which means the Rams win the draft again, because they always seem to figure out a way to have the best player drop to them every year. And we saw it last year with Jared Verse, Braden Fisk, Cam Kinchins as well. They've got some really nice players on the defense, and I think Malachi Starks only adds to that. We already talked about him a little bit earlier on in this, but I mean, you park him next to Cam Kinchins on that defense, and you have two really young safeties who can play at a high level. And I think that Rams defense is going to take a huge step forward if you draft Malachi Starks, and just another piece for Sean McVay and that team to work with. So the Ravens at 27, I think they need some edge help here. I really do, because most of their sacks came from Kyle Van Noy, and Kyle Van Noy is an older player who's actually really just a middle linebacker, kind of playing out on the edge. So I think a guy that's their type is Nick Scourton. He transferred in from Purdue. He was a really nice player for Purdue. Went to Texas A&M this last year, and he didn't really look the same as he has in the past at Purdue. I don't know if he was just a bit heavier than he was in the past, because he didn't look as fast to me or as twitched up as I've seen him. But he's a guy I saw a lot watching Purdue play. I think he had 10 sacks with Purdue 2 years ago, so a lot of production then. Not as much this last year. But the Ravens always get guys, at the back of the first round and develop them into really nice edge rushers. I mean, you look at Odafe Owe, who they took a few years ago, didn't even record a sack in college. They took him about this range in the first round. He's developed into a really, athletic and freakish pass rusher. And, outside of him, they don't really have a lot of guys who can step up. David Ojabo at one point was a really promising guy, but just hasn't really shown that much this year. So for me, the Ravens would take Nick Scourton and have a really good player right away. And I think that he's just, you look at him and you go, he's a Raven. He would fit that culture and that physicality that they like to draft guys with. So for me, that's a great pick. The Lions here, this is another easy one. Jack Sawyer. I mean, it doesn't get much more Dan Campbell than this. This is a hard-nosed player who puts his hard hat on in the run. He's a really good pass rusher as well. Had a monstrous couple of games in the college football playoff. I mean, he had pretty much the championship defining strip sack of Quinn Ewers against Texas and returned that ball for a touchdown. Like, this guy's a proven winner. You could tell the loyalty he had to this Ohio State program, because he was a 5-star kid from Ohio, and you could tell he really wanted to win it for his home state, and that's exactly what he did. So that's the type of player that Dan Campbell and this Lions group really loves. And, they just need someone else outside of Aiden Hutchinson. He'll pair very nicely across from him. So for me, that's just the easiest pick. If Jack Sawyer's right there for the Lions, they have to take him. I mean, he fits so well into what they're trying to do on defense and that culture that they're bringing in, over the last couple of seasons. So the Commanders at 29, I'm going to go edge rusher here, and I'm going to look at Princely Umanmielen from Ole Miss. This was a guy who started his career at Florida and could have probably gone to the draft out of Florida, and I think would have been a second round or maybe even, a similar pick to this. But he chose to come back for, some more college football and play for Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, and had another really nice year. Against Georgia, he had 3 sacks and a forced fumble and was really impactful. He was pretty much the reason that defensive line was able to dominate Georgia up front. And this is a guy who his moves are as good as anybody else in this draft, and that's why I wanted more from him a little bit. But the production hasn't always been there, and that's kind of, to me, what's going to keep him from going in the top 10 is he just doesn't have the insane sack numbers that he probably should have for his skill set. And some of that is just a bit of attitude issues, in my opinion, as well. He's got a few, questionable decisions that he's made in the past with, his social media presence and kind of comments he's made post-game. But, I think the Commanders, with Dan Quinn and the culture they've set up, is a great place for a player like this who's kind of a bit of a loose cannon to go to and become a stable player. And the Commanders really need a contributor on the edge who's not, in the threat to leave, because Dante Fowler is going to leave in free agency, and that's your best pass rusher. So to me, Princely Umanmielen's a great pick for the Commanders there, and I think you get a great young pass rusher who's shown a lot on tape over the last couple of years. Next, for the Buffalo Bills, I'm actually going to go to the defensive line for them, and I'm going to take a guy that I really liked this year, and that's Derek Harmon from Oregon. As you can see, PFF has him way down the draft board, but to me, this player, he transferred in from Michigan State, really didn't do much at Michigan State, but he had 5 sacks from the inside of this defensive line this year and looked like a real disruptor. And those, I'm telling you, those guys go higher than you might think. And to me, Dan Lanning did a great job of getting the most out of this player. And I really enjoyed watching him play. Again, against Ohio State, he made a few impactful plays that, forced a few punts and kept Oregon in that game, actually, when they had a chance coming out of halftime. But for me, the Bills just need some help, in the run game, in the trenches. They have Ed Oliver, who's great. They have a few other really nice pieces, but Derek Harmon would fit really well on the defensive line. He's a big body too. He's over 6'5" and well over 300 pounds. So I think that guy in the middle of their defense would be an instant contributor to stuffing the run and a little bit of pass rush upside. So the Eagles at 31, this is easily the hardest team to draft for because their roster is stacked from top to bottom. I mean, there's just a lot of different scenarios that I could see happening here. Howie Roseman really likes SEC guys, so I mean, maybe you see Demetrius Knight, a linebacker from South Carolina, go to them, but they also never seem to really take linebackers in the draft. So I'm going to give them Colston Loveland and just give them, what I think to be the best player available here. I know they have Dallas Goedert, who's not going anywhere, but why not take another tight end to develop behind him? And, you have Dallas Goedert and Colston Loveland, who many people thought Colston Loveland was the best tight end coming into this year, and then Tyler Warren just had a monster year. So I think that's kind of how you have to approach the Eagles, is just take the best player available and, stack the deck even more than it's already stacked. And, that's just another phenomenal player that falls to Howie Roseman and the Eagles front office here at 31. So we'll wrap this up with the Chiefs here. PFF's predicting them to win the Super Bowl, which means they pick last. So I think that the Chiefs could go a variety of different ways. Their offensive line really struggled this year. So I would look at potentially Wyatt Milam here. If you look at his PFF grades, he was phenomenal all year. 91 PFF grade this year. That speaks for itself. Hasn't allowed a single sack his entire college career either. Like that's what you got to do, especially at this level of competition too. And I think that's a guy who would come in and contribute right away for the Chiefs. And you look at their tackles this year; they're just a huge liability. And it's funny to say that because they're in the Super Bowl, but Wyatt Milam would come in and he has all the makings to me to be a franchise tackle for them. And I just think that having another tackle like that, like they drafted Kingsley Suamataia last year, and he kind of looked okay, but he also got hurt this year. So just another young tackle for the Chiefs there. So yeah, with that concludes this mock draft. I think overall it's a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Obviously, no one can predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think this, we could see some guys in here that, could go higher or lower than what I put them. But I also think I included some guys that you might not see in the other mainstream mock drafts online. So I think that's the best part about this. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any suggestions, if you totally disagree with me as well, I'm open to hearing that. But thanks for tuning in. We'll do a few more of these as the draft approaches in about 87 days or so. We'll keep running it back.